Welcome everyone. I hope it won't be that bad in the rest of the talk. This, as is introduced, I'm from Geonovum. Geonovum is in the Netherlands the organization who is taking care of the implementation of Inspire in the Netherlands. Not responsible, but taking care, which means that we support a lot of those actions. And this is one of the projects we initiated, in fact, because we noticed that there were a lot of questions around how to continue with Inspire when it's not fulfilling all the needs we have at the moment. So let me introduce that what we did. It is not a full study in itself, but it is a full project. It's a study to explore and make an inventory of what is needed and what you can do when you're going to extend Inspire models. So basically what we had in mind and what was to be expected is that you can use certain patterns which you can use to create extensions, and on that we would like to have the first guidelines to help and support people also having the same issues. What the guidelines are in the end is not a dry document, but it is an online interactive guideline. So it's not static, and it can be updated even after the duration of the project, as long as it be maintained, but that's one of the challenges we have. And it should be noted that what we present is also something which you have to have some expertise in that, and you have to have knowledge about modeling, UML, implementation schemas, that kind of things. What we try to do in the end is that we would like to cover the full chain, which means that you come from data until you have published the data according to the Inspire guidelines. We initiated as Geonovum in the Netherlands, but it is a joint effort. So what we did, we invited the European Union to support us, and we also need everyone in the member states having their input from different best practices, from different exercises already carried out on this topic, and follow-up is needed. So the project, in short, I will cover at least those basic questions: why, what, how, who, and when. So the why is that we want to support the policy and to make the business process more efficiently and effectively. What we have seen, as I already stated, that there are a lot of questions about how can we extend the Inspire specifications, the Inspire models in order to be able to use it in an efficient way. And what was also triggering in the Netherlands is that currently we are having a new spatial planning act, which is a reform of a lot of, at least more than 30 different policy regulations which we had on spatial planning to have in one law. And for that there is also something which we call the digital data environment, which is needed to support all the tasks and processes needed to fulfill any application for building things, taking initiatives and that kind of things, which relates to spatial planning. And this new act will become in force next 2018. So what are the steps to create such an extension? Still, we have a lot to find out. There is what we discovered with people dealing with Inspire, a lot of uncertainty how to do it, what will be the correct way to use the methodology, which is in the end leading towards an interoperable extension. So as an example, how would you transform the existing data which you already use into harmonized data which you can use in the following processes? The what? We provide a guidance which covers organizational and technical aspects as well, and it should be helpful to extend the Inspire model as already stated. And how do we do that? That is that we carried out this study to make, first of all, an inventory of what is already done in the European Union, in the member states, around extending the different Inspire models. And the second thing, of course, is based on that, try to find the patterns which can be useful for data providers in the member state to apply that to their own data. Who is involved in this study? As mentioned, Geonovum initiated this one. We commissioned WeTransform to do the body of the of the work, which means that they carried out a lot of the technical stuff which is inside. We didn't do it alone because we have an advisory board, as I mentioned already, supported by GG Environment, GSC and EAA. So they are all members of that advisory board. And we said that we would like to have a lot of input from experts all over Europe. So we defined and invited an expert group to assist in the process. And in the background, we have already the Inspire stakeholders in place by the maintenance groups, the LMOs, SDICs, and the thematic clusters, as is probably known to you. Shortly, inside the project, so Genovum is starting it, WeTransform is working the body of the work, supported by the European Union and the expert group. Well, basically, that's already what I mentioned a minute ago. Outside the project, the advisory committee, so the people who will support our work are in the advisory committee, and in the background, the stakeholders. To be more concrete, how does these groups are composed? The project group, people from Genovum and WeTransform, the expert group all over the European Union, and the advisory board. When should that be done? Because the study is carried out already, as you can see from the timeline. We started in March, carrying out a survey to collect all the different experiences in extending and extensions of Inspire. Then we had a first meeting with our expert group. We drafted the report meanwhile, and then a second time we invited the expert group to review what was already made available and see if we can go forward on that part. And in the end, the final report, it states here July, but it's more or less past the summer as well, but it's finished now. So it will end today and this week at the Inspire conference when we try to tell you, the audience, what we did. And I think that covers more or less my part of the talk as an introduction, what the project itself was and how we started it and what we did. And now I would like to give the floor to Torsten to go more into detail in the results, which is probably more interesting than what I told so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan-Dirk. What we did was basically from the beginning on, our goal was to involve the community as good as possible. So the first step was actually doing a survey. We had some feelings, and there was some groundwork basically laid by what happened in the Netherlands about what needs to be done. But in the end, it's always good to actually confirm your assessments and your hypothesis. So the first thing that we did was actually set up a survey. And that survey, I'm not sure, did some of you reply to that? I see a couple of people who I know responded to that, but obviously I don't want to point you out. You don't have to raise your hands. But anyway, so we had about 117 responses to that survey, which I consider quite good. It's quite a niche subject. We distributed it through all kinds of channels, like through the Thematic Clusters platform, through mailing lists, through websites, through LinkedIn even. And if you consider all of that, then the total response rate is about 3%. In the higher focus groups, good morning, the actual response rate was somewhere between 10 and 20%. We also noticed that even though the questionnaire was rather long, if you filled in everything, you had to spend about 15 minutes. There was a very low rate of incomplete responses, so people were really interested in seeing where this is going. And out of these 117 people, we got more than 40 responses that actually described an Inspire extension, though there were some duplicates. So in the end, it was 37 data models that are related to an Inspire data specification. Yet in these 37 different data models, according to the information that we got from the people filling out the survey, these are the main things that they did. So it's really about what do you actually do when you extend an Inspire data specification. And it's pretty much what you would expect. So most people actually create new data types, they add properties to them. They might also do some profiling, so basically clarifying in some places of the data model what exactly they need, like prescribing a defined geometry type and things like that. Something that was also very common was adding or extending code lists, which is good because that's one of the things that was there to be extended. And in some cases also formal constraints were added, like for example rules about how geometries of different feature classes need to behave in respect to each other. Yeah, so that was one of the core questions that we wanted to know. So what are people actually doing already? But then another thing was also, what do they plan to do? And here, like I said, we found that about slightly less than 40% of the respondents had already worked with an Inspire extension. But obviously we wanted to know how much more is there on the horizon. And do you actually plan to continue working on that? And there was, in addition to the about 40 people that had a data model already, there's another slightly less than 40 that indicated they are planning to develop one. And then regarding the data models that are already there, most of these are actually meant to be used long term. So we can see here the green part, that's 14 out of the set. People who responded here said that yes, they have long-term resources available to continue investing in these Inspire extensions. And some, at least the equal number, 14, also have short-term resources. The 6 ones where they said, no, we are not planning to continue that, that's also a good indication. Most of these were research projects or let's say smaller pilots where for different reasons there are currently no plans to actually continue this kind of work. But like I said in the beginning, we were also very much interested in finding out whether our assumptions about what the challenges are correct. And we had 2 questions related to that. So one question was about more the organizational challenges and design challenges. And there the result was overwhelmingly clear. So that was clearly people were unsure about how to actually do it, about the methodology. So there's some other challenges like basic knowledge of standards and so on, but that was actually quite good. So most people that responded to the survey had a very good understanding, at least to their information, about UML, about the ISO standards, and about GML. But what they really struggled with was, so how do I actually go about creating this Inspire extension? And then we also wanted to know what the technical challenges are that people encountered. And here in the technical challenges, the number 1 was actually systems integration. So you can see that, all of them have a lot of, let's say, serious kind of issues. But the one that had the most in comparison was systems integration, followed by model transformation, data transformation, and then data usage. The one thing that's already seems to be quite good is data publishing, also regarding the comments that we got. The data publishing part itself, that's the one where we have a lot of tools by now available, and while there are some practical issues, apparently most people are able to overcome them. All right. Yeah, and then there's, of course, the actual inventory of models. So this is a bit of an older list. We have a backlog of additional models that we need to integrate with the study, but right now there's 19 online, 19 different extensions. Maybe to give you a bit of information about the others that are out there. So we have by now, I think, more than almost 20 extensions that are actually in production usage. So there are lots of organizations throughout Europe that have really decided to pick up on the Inspire infrastructure and create production services that are linked or that are compliant with Inspire as well. All right, so we'll have a look at that a bit later then in detail. Okay, so what I want to give you now in the next 20 or so minutes is a quick overview, good morning, of what we've actually proposed. So basically, what are the different parts of the study and how you can use that. And then for the rest of the workshop, we'll actually look at these in a bit more detail. So you'll get the 30,000 foot overview first, and then we'll dive down into a couple of areas. Jandek mentioned this. We actually have all the materials online. So there's a website that has pretty much everything that we describe on it, and then some more. It's pretty much impossible to go through all of that material in this workshop. I don't think that would make sense. But what we would really like to encourage you, if there's something where you think, okay, this is helpful to me that I saw in the overview and that wasn't really addressed in detail in the workshop itself, then just visit the website later again. And feel also free to reach out to us, of course. We're here for the rest of the week. Okay, so the first thing was, many of you were actually involved in the drafting of the Inspire data specification. So you know fully well that there was this model-driven approach, or still is, with the idea that we would have a consistent and well-structured approach across all the different working groups. So we had, for basically, for every theme there was a working group, and obviously we didn't want them to come up with completely inconsistent solutions. The other thing that this approach enabled us to do is also to model cross-theme relationships, of which we have quite a few. That's one of the core values of the Inspire data specifications, is that we are not looking at layers that live in isolation, but actually we have the possibility to really understand how things belong together. Yeah, another thing that this approach allowed us to do was to learn from all the experiences that different groups had, because there's one central process that we're all using and that we're continuously improving. If somebody made an error or found something that could be improved, it could be applied to all of the working groups. Yeah, and finally, this approach also allows to use central tools and central encodings and things like that, so that we don't really have to create 100 different solutions, but we can instead create just a consistent set. All right. So, and that's the basis also for what we did with the Inspire extensions approach. So we said that's a solid foundation, the model-driven approach that was used in Inspire. We shouldn't try to get rid of that or do something that doesn't work together with that. But what we did was we kind of started from an earlier level. We said we're not going to look at the technical approach first, but rather we'll start with organization. So basically trying to put what we learned from various projects, also Inspire extensions projects that we did previously. We really wanted to give people not just technical tools and technical how-to, but rather also an organizational set of best practices or recommendations. Yeah, this is roughly the process that we've described. So it's basically from use case to data specification, which was also validated and so on. And we actually start with organizing a thematic working group. So like I said, a lot of the feedback that we got was that people were actually unsure how to do that, what skills do they need, what people need to be involved and so on. So we actually put that as well in here. There's collecting use cases and identifying user requirements, spatial objects, and so on. So yeah, at the end of this model, you will notice that we have an iteration. So we really expect that one thing that's really important is the validation, so that there's not a long phase of where you actually just design your model and then after many years something drops out and you try to implement it, but rather the approach that we've taken is one where you quickly get a result and then iterate over that to improve that. And at some time release it and of course maintain it. So to get to this in more in detail, so the first step is organize building your working group, analyze, find out what you need to do, compare. That's especially important as we're talking about Inspire specifications and extensions, so we don't want to duplicate things that happened already. Then we actually create the design. We validate that, so there are various methods of validation for a model that all have to do with looking at it, for example, in how does it behave in implementation, does it actually satisfy the requirements that we've identified before. Then consult, so we basically want to know from the stakeholders, from the people who will use data in that model, whether it really works for them. And finally, operate. Yeah, and like I mentioned, the idea was really to make this an iteration. So basically, we have larger iterations and smaller ones. So for example, after we've organized our working group, we go through analysis, comparison, design, validation. Let's say in validation we find a problem. Let's say, for example, the data model as we've designed cannot be implemented on the platform that we need to implement it on. So we iterate once more, or we find that it doesn't fulfill a requirement. When we've come to a point that the validation results are okay, so technically the model is fine, it fulfills the requirements, it's time to make a release and to really get the feedback from the community. That can be doesn't have to be a final release, it can also be an intermediate one. That's actually also one of the best practices that we got a lot as input from the survey, is to never call it final before you've released one version and let people play around with it. So for example, I remember a discussion where input from Ordnance Survey was that they always do that. They always release early, they release draft versions, and they let people play around with the model before they actually say, okay, now it's final, now we set our production processes and so on this. Yeah, and then you also, retrospective means as much as that you also look at the organizational processes and structures that you've made. So you don't just look at how well does the technical setup work and does it fulfill your functional requirements, but actually also did the team work together well, or the things that you need to improve. That's also part of that, so that's why it points back to organized. You might find that you need, for example, an additional expert in some field to really be able to do the work that you plan to do. Yeah, so that's the high-level overview of the actual process. So we're going to have a bit more detailed look into that later. So let's have a look now in detail at one or two of the steps. Jan-Dirk mentioned already that in step 4, the design step, we actually have something that we call patterns. I assume most of you know patterns from software engineering or other areas. The idea is that there are reusable solutions that you can just pick according to your needs, and then you have a very concrete solution that you can easily apply instead of having to try to find out everything. So one of the core things about the step number 4, about design, is to provide these patterns. So first of all, the expert group identified those, and then we described them in detail, complete with solutions, how to implement them on different platforms. The result of this is a pattern catalog. So in total, I think we identified about 8 patterns. And there's essentially 3 levels of patterns, so not all are the same. So those of you who know the classical Gamma work in software engineering on patterns, they also had several categories. And what we did was we created 3. So the first one is patterns for model compliance. So the question is, are there general rules that a model, extension as well in this case, needs to fulfill so that it can actually be considered, for example, a valid Inspire extension? And that's what the Inspire generic conceptual model pattern is defining. There's one more that we looked at for comparison, which is the CityGML application domain extension that can be used in addition, so they're not exclusive. Yeah, and then there's the main body is actually went into the patterns for adding classes and properties, because that's what it usually boils down to. So we want to actually, we need to add something to the model to really cover the business needs that we have. And this was actually an interesting debate over a full 2 days in the expert group to really clarify what each of these is, how they work, in which context they can be applied. And that's what we'll look at a bit later as well. The final thing is actually patterns for modifying properties. And in the end, we kept 2. There are actually a couple more. For example, you probably know that there's really weird stuff, so to speak, that you can do in UML. And we've decided not to do everything in this pattern catalog that you could do, but rather try to really recommend basically, let's say, the 80% solutions, not necessarily everything, especially in cases where the tool support is not yet there. And so the 2 patterns for modifying properties that more or less survived are pretty simple ones. It's adding constraints. That's what I mentioned before. If you want to, for example, exactly define what kind of geometry types you allow, or if there needs to be certain relationships between properties, that's what can go here. And then there's also the code list extension example. So that's when we add specific values to code lists, or we actually make entirely new code lists. Yeah, and for each of the patterns, what we've described is, first of all, it's the structure. So it's basically the spatial object types that are involved with that and how they are related. We've also included a section for each one on when to use it and when not to use it. So there's usually a set of indications, and if you can tick them up and you see, okay, that's 3 positives for using that and no negatives, then that might be a strong candidate. But if you find it the other way around, then you might not want to use that. We've also decided to include examples. So in this case, an XML schema example and an XML instance example. Of course, there are some tools which help you with generating them, but we found that for the configuration of these tools, it's really helpful to know what the end result should look like. So in this case, we basically created a schema example and instance example, also because that's the encoding that Inspire basically requires, or that we use as the standard encoding. There's a final section or another section on implementation consideration. So some patterns can be implemented well, for example, on a relational database. And other patterns can be implemented well on an object-oriented system. And some patterns are really, really hard to implement on most platforms. Let's say it like this. So and that's something you should know. So if you want to use something like multiple inheritance, there's a question of, okay, how can I actually use that, let's say, on a geodatabase environment, for example. Yeah, then finally, for each pattern, we also have examples from the model repository inventory. So there's this inventory with currently 19 models in it, and we wanted to make sure that there are examples for most of the patterns there, so that you can actually look at this and see, how does it look like in the real world, more or less. Yeah, so the typical structure of such a pattern is this one. Here we have an aggregation one. So we see we have an extension. So here's always the extension package in these examples is, whoops, sorry. That didn't work? Oh, it did, okay. So we always have more or less a class that extends something. And here we also have an extension owner class. So the structure here is that we aggregate between the class join parcel and owner. Obviously, there are other ways to do that. That's generally a rule in data modeling. There's not the perfect one solution, but usually there are many solutions, and it's a kind of a trade-off to pick one over the other. But what we're trying to do with this is also to give you some tools to actually decide which one might be most applicable for you. And we come to that when we later look at the validation things again. Yeah, so that's the structure part. The XML schema part, that's what you would expect. It's an XML schema document. So we try to keep it as short as possible. So these are really more or less artificial examples. There's clear that in the real world you would probably have to add a little bit more of things, but we basically try to keep it to the most important things. Same about the instance example. So these are usually a couple lines, not more. So there's no gigantic geometries or anything in them. But we really try to keep it relatively short here. Okay, good. Then I mentioned this before. So one of the things that we saw that was really challenging was actually the systems integration part. And we also said that we want to provide real feedback. So in the sense of we actually want to not just design something and then throw it over the fence and see what happens, but actually we really want to have in the process a fast loop. And that actually means we need to have full system integration, because we can only learn whether our data model works when we've published data and people have used it. And they're telling us, well, this didn't work or this didn't work and this one was great. That's the kind of feedback we wanted. Yeah, so one of the core parts that we also did was creating an end-to-end tutorial with one data set, and ideally something where we can really pick up one thing, go to the next system, then go to the next system, and really go through the entire process from data modeling over schema transformation, data transformation, to service publishing. Yeah, that's more or less the fast overview. To provide a little bit of more concrete a more concrete view of how this works, we've invited two presentations. The first one from Kati Schleit about existing Inspire extensions. And if you're okay with that, I would hand over to you. Do you already have questions at this point? Yes?
Maybe somebody could go to the neighbor room and ask them.
Oh, it tells me that your presentation is not accessible anymore. That's kind of funny.
It's too early.
Yeah, maybe 10 minutes. See, I wanted to make sure that you're not too late for your other presentation. And now we're... is there somebody from the technical staff here? Because the network is not accessible anymore. It's kind of... just wanted to open the other presentation, but
It's empty.
yeah, it says it was there a moment ago and now it's gone. Okay, good. So let me see if I can show you a little bit more meanwhile. Okay, that part still works. Oh, yeah. Ah. Hmm. Doesn't do cloning. That would be a pity. Okay. So, no, I don't have it yet.
Your memory stick, which you can find that, and you can find mine.
I actually didn't have one. Good morning.
You have it over here?
Yeah, I think she's looking for one right now. Is it possible to duplicate the screen?
Yeah, we cannot do it locally.
Yeah. Is it also possible to duplicate the screen?
Okay, yeah.
Because I wanted to show this website anyway. Yeah, but then I can't. I mean, I need to look at this screen while
Okay.
I navigate. This is shown, so that doesn't work really.
No worries.
Normally you duplicate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good.
So here we are.
Thank you.
So, is she having it or?
Do you have it?
I will put you both off. Okay.
Introduction into the air quality reporting Inspire extension.
Okay, I'm Kathi Schleit, and I've done what is mostly guaranteed to be the very first Inspire extension because it was done, I think, 2 weeks after the Inspire data models. So it was really a very parallel work, and so I'll explain you how the very first Inspire extension happened. Okay, so the overview, I'll give you a short overview of the requirements for the air quality e-reporting, then some information on the extension pattern used, benefits gained, and also a bit of reflection, what would I do differently based on what I know now. Okay, so a bit of background information for everybody who hasn't seen this before. There's an air quality directive which came out 2008. This requires the yearly reporting of air quality data together with all of the necessary metadata. How was it measured? Where was it measured? Why was it measured? All of this additional stuff. It also includes up-to-date real-time air quality data. So you've got the measurements from all stations in Europe coming into the European Environment Agency on an hourly basis. And the cool thing is that whoever was involved in setting up this Directive 2008 had already figured out that Inspire is there and put in a clause, I think I know who he's sitting here, put in a clause that the data provision should be running in accordance with Inspire. So we knew from the start we're doing this new reporting obligation and we have to make sure that Inspire fits to it. The nice bit, as I was saying, this was basically done in parallel with Inspire, so I could cheat a little bit and make sure that Inspire also fit to air quality reporting. This did make things a bit easier than the task everybody else has, but it was still a challenge. Okay, and the data, at least as far as I understand, is all supposed to be made available via web services, at least on the mid-range basis. A quick overview of what do we have in air quality. There's some other stuff, there are plans and programs, I'm not going to talk about that because that's far away from Inspire, but we have information on zones and agglomerations, we have assessment regimes, we've got the Dataflow-D is the information about all the assessment methodology, where are their stations, how are they configured, instrumented. Dataflow-E are the primary measurements, these are really the hourly measurements going in, both in a near real-time version and also then validated at the end of the year. Dataflow-F are then various aggregates of this primary data, and G is information on the attainment of the environmental objectives. So two of these data flows, the assessment regime and the attainment information, this is really just administrative information. It's not based on any Inspire anything. There's nothing in Inspire dealing with these concepts of saying, we will measure these things this year in this way. Same thing with the attainment, have we reached it? So what I did here is I modeled it in accordance with Inspire, since we said this is one block of data, it has to be interoperable. We're not going to do a different technology for these two pieces and then Inspire for the rest. For the other bits I went through and said, okay, what are the Inspire themes which are relevant? Zones and agglomerations fit very nicely into the area management theme, and the rest falls into the environmental monitoring facilities. So then I do this as the basis for this, but we had all sorts of information, what all needs to be reported. I've got a detailed talk on how all of this was done. If somebody's interested, I can throw it at you. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details of mapping and comparing and seeing what's missing and adding. But at the end of the day, based on my experience then, we took the inheritance pattern. So we said, on the left side, you've got the environmental monitoring facility. On the right side, you've got the air quality station. And here we've got the various attributes we need in addition. So using inheritance, a new class was defined, which includes all of the additional attributes required on the station level, in addition to the basic Inspire requirements. The same thing was done for the various other concepts, so we don't just have stations, we've got sampling points, we have whatever. But everything was done using inheritance or defining new classes for bits where there was no base concept available in Inspire. Reasoning behind it, okay, I mean, the one bit, as I stated, we didn't have all of these nice thoughts about it at that time, so I was just running on what I do. Now we can do this much more reflected, but the reasoning I had also for doing this intuitively was saying the information is very tightly coupled with the class being extended. So it's also information which is relevant beyond European reporting. This is stuff which other people could also use. One of the other patterns which Dawson didn't get around to presenting this morning was saying you could also leave the original Inspire class untouched, add the additional information as a totally separate new class, and then just point to that via an association. All has strengths and weaknesses. In this case, the extension pattern just seemed like the most sensible way to go. The further advantage, to my view, is you have less features to deal with than if you're doing the base Inspire class and then an additional information class. And as I stated, we were still learning as fast as we could. Benefits gained. I mean, the big advantage to my view is you create the data once, you put it online, and you have multiple requirements covered. So you've got both Inspire and your thematic reporting covered. The full information is available to all interested parties, so it's not just you make the bare bones Inspire stuff available and everything else goes to the EEA, it's nobody's business, make things nicely transparently open. And it also allows for the reuse of both server and client technologies across various domains and use cases and the like. And a bit of critical reflection on it. These are things which I hadn't really thought of when we started this, and one of the reasons why we started discussing could it make more sense not to use inheritance to define a new class which isn't associated with the old class. The problem is if you now access the air quality data feeds, you're going to be confronted with feature types you've never seen before. And you need an intelligent system, so either you need a person who goes in and looks at the data models or at the XSDs and sees, okay, this AQD station, I know this, it's an environmental monitoring facility, I can digest this. But you need either good technology to do this or interested people. And that's one of the things which we also stumbled across during the implementation phase of air quality. At some point, one of the German programmers got in touch with me and said, Kati, I only have half the attributes. And then I looked at it and I realized whatever Java library he was using to define his objects couldn't digest the whole derivation hierarchy. So I think he only had the attributes defined at the final air quality class, and he was missing all of the Inspire bits. So this is also a point where technology is still catching up with what we really want and need. Conclusions, both approaches and also the various other approaches detailed in Thorsten's very nice survey and analysis of this have their strengths and weaknesses. We are still learning. That's why I also very much appreciate that Thorsten is also working in a very iterative approach. I wish we had been able to do this with air quality. It just wasn't possible at the time. But this is also something I can recommend to anybody out there trying it. Do it in small steps and try and get there. And then you will have something really solid people can work with. That's it. Questions? I should have probably brought coffee instead of talking.
Thank you very much, Kati. So yeah, you don't even need to run, I hope. So you can just walk over. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. So that was one example of how, for a production process, you can actually use an Inspire extension. And yeah, so we have about 40 minutes in this block left. And for this time, the idea was that we'll mostly look at the actual content of the study and at the analysis part. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of these things. We're a bit of a large group, so I think it would be very hard to do a hands-on with small groups in the room, but I would really like to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or things that you would actually like to experiment with in parallel, then please do so. From my perspective, especially in the analysis phase, the best tool is actually pen and paper. So don't get all hung up in Enterprise Architect or other tools. It's really in the beginning, it's understanding what we need and what's already there. And the second part is then really getting into the technicalities. Okay, so let me set this up again. If I get a cursor at least. Ah, here. The all famous trick. All right. Okay. Yeah, so this is the website that we've mentioned. And the very first thing that I would like to say is it's an open source website. So if you feel the need or the urge to contribute something to it, then please do so. There's a link here at the bottom left, and there's also a description in the introduction section of this that tells you how you could actually contribute to that. So let's say you find an error in something, or you actually have another Inspire model extension or a pattern or something that you'd like to contribute, then please feel free to do so. It requires a slight bit of technical knowledge to do that. So if you don't feel too well with that, then just send me an email and I'll make sure that we can include it in a different way. But just I wanted to say this is really meant to be a resource for the community and something that we can build on bit by bit. Okay. Yeah, so the first thing that I wanted to show you here is, after we've talked briefly about the results and so on before, is what actually a model extension in this inventory currently looks like. So, for example, since we're in Catalonia, I think it's just appropriate that I pick that example. So each of these model extensions has a short description that provides information about, for example, what schema language was used to create it, what tools, what's the license, and so on. So there's a quick overview of that. We also have information about what Inspire models it actually references and what kind of patterns it used. There's also an external link here, so if there's an external resource that describes it in more detail, oops, that didn't work, great. Then normally that is provided here. Let me just pick another one. For example, I think this one. Yeah. So that's then the actual reference document that describes the model in full. So usually we don't try to duplicate information that is available elsewhere, but really try to keep it simple in the sense of giving you a quick overview, what Inspire models is it related to, and what patterns does it use. So here, if you look at this list again, you can actually also see that there's, for example, for aggregation, association, inheritance seems to be the most common one. We even have a couple of mix-ins, and then we actually have all those that are associated with a given Inspire scheme. So, long list. So you can see usually it's not an awful lot. All right. Yeah, so that's what the inventory currently looks like. And I know I have about 6 or 7 more models that I actually wanted to publish. I didn't manage to do it before the conference. It's one of the things that we need to add. Yeah, and there's probably more. So if you know about anything, any work that you've done and would really like to have that added here, then just let us know. Okay, so given that there is already a whole bunch of Inspire extensions, the question was also, so how did people actually approach that? And we condensed both the information that we got from the survey and from the expert group into the actual extension methodology. And this methodology, we had a quick look at that before, actually has several different phases. So you've seen this diagram. The idea was really that we will start, we don't assume too much. The only thing that we said we would assume is a basic knowledge of modeling concepts. So for example, this is not a UML tutorial, but we're instead assuming that you do know what a class is and you do know what a property of that class is and so on. There's a section in the introduction that gives brief definitions of these terms, but we didn't really see it as our task to provide a general purpose introduction into object-oriented analysis and design, for example. But what we did say is that we saw a lot of really valuable input in terms of how to organize the whole process, how to do the analysis and so on, so we wanted to include that. Yeah, so the first part that's the organization and working agreements section. So that really includes information about what kind of team do you need, what kind of skills do you need to go through this whole process, to go through this whole methodology. That's the first part here, so the team part. So for example, we always assume there's going to be a project lead. We describe what kind of properties that person ideally has. We have domain experts, so those are the people who actually know the meaning of the things that need to be modeled in our extensions. We ideally also have a modeling expert, so that's the person who knows every modeling concept inside out. They know their UML, they know their ISO 191XX standards, and so on. We also have an integration expert, so that's the person who knows what to do with data, actually. So there's the model, and how do we get whatever we have right now into it. And then we have a sponsor. So usually that's somebody who is interested in getting the project forward. And that could also be multiple people, of course. Yeah? It's the non-technical stakeholders that help you make the project happen. So yeah, we also call these supporting stakeholders. Yeah, so we've seen actually the average team size, that's also something from the survey that we saw, is 3 to 5 people. So usually 1 or 2 of the roles will be embedded in one person. So there might be a domain expert who's also very knowledgeable about all the standards, and the project lead might also be an integration expert, things like that. But we've actually also had groups of 11 to 20 people. So about 5 or 6 of the extension teams reported that they had these really large working teams. Yeah, and the larger the working team, the more important it is that you have a clear set of work agreements. So work agreements is, you don't just sit together and say, let's get started, but you actually, first of all, discuss how are we going to work and what exactly are we going to do. And that starts already with making it clear whose role is which. So even in a data modeling project that involves many different steps like this, it's really helpful to get a clear understanding of who's responsible for that. So for example, is there one person who's responsible for just monitoring the process and making notes if something goes wrong? Or is there somebody who's really responsible automatically for everything that has to do with data and schema transformation and things like that? Yeah, I've also advertised heavily already for doing short iterations. So not just basically doing the project in one big iteration that might take 6 or 12 months or longer, but rather really from the start on saying we'll have our first model after 1 week, 2 weeks, something like that. Sometimes you can even make a kickoff workshop and already say that's at the end of that workshop, that's where we'll have our first model. Another thing that's really important is in all these discussions you're going to make a lot of decisions, and there's going to be a lot of knowledge basically going into each of the decisions. So when you model something and you have a discussion around that, you actually need to document that. So you describe why did you do certain things at certain points in time. And that's also what you need to decide a priori what to do. Another thing that you need to look at is capacity building. So that's something that we've seen a lot, is that people in the beginning, they start a project and they don't really assess qualities and capacities they have in the team, and at some point they run into trouble, and then they look for the actual skills that they need, or they train them, and that makes the whole thing take much longer. So I hope that this really also enables you to take a proactive approach at capacity building and early on finding out what kind of things do you need to train in your team, or where you might need some external support for. Yeah, then one thing that was really popping up a lot was natural language usage. Is the model going to be in English, or is it going to be in your local language? Let's say it's Spanish or Catalan or something. And do you actually translate the Inspire model? So you know that the Inspire schemas, the official ones, use English terminology. And I saw many groups that actually first translate that model so that it's easier for the local domain experts to work with that. Yeah, another thing is then, of course, things like meetings and communication. So basically, how do you really structure your teamwork? That's especially important when it's, like we've also seen quite often, when you have a team of people working across many different organizations, like in a national case. And then there's 3 more structural things that are change management. So how do you actually deal with external changes? I think we've all been there. Policy requirements change, technical things change, and so on. How do we actually deal with those? It's also important to say what's the time and commitment that we're going to put in. So basically, I think most of us know that we are all very well occupied, and it's rarely a day where we are bored. So the question is really when and how much time can we put into this, and this should be aligned across the different people involved in the project. Yeah, when we've gone through these things, and I think it's really helpful. I mean, it's basically just common sense to look at these things really for any modeling project, not just an Inspire modeling project. But when we've done these things, we've clarified how we're going to work together. The next step is really deciding on what's going to be our work environment. So work environment and tools usually means that we set up a common infrastructure and we agree on using a set of tools like software to actually implement that. That doesn't necessarily have to happen all in the first minutes of the project. There can be short evaluations done, like let's say for example, there's a workshop going on right now on choosing the right download service technology. So you might do something like that and actually say, okay, I want to know which download service should I later use and which tool for data modeling and so on. That's usually also makes sense to discuss that early on in the project to decide what are we going to use. We're not going to go into detail on all of these, but this is just a suggestion of the kind of tools that you might actually need. And it goes into a wide range of things. So there's, for example, the enterprise architect model validation scripts, data modeling tools. You need to generate an application schema. At some point, you also need to integrate data. The publishing part is something I just mentioned. And ideally, you are able to actually look at the data in the end using a GIS client or other software. Yeah, that's something I leave to you. There's no recommendations. There's a list of options. That's the ones that we know best for each of these categories. But you're basically, obviously, based on your experiences, that's what you would pick. Okay. Now that we've actually agreed on how we are going to work and which tools, the first part is looking at what exactly do we need to do it and why. So that's called more or less the requirements analysis. So the first step is really typically to perform a scoping analysis. So that's basically the question of what's inside our project and what's not inside, what's outside. So for that, it's really important to understand exactly why are we doing a certain project. So for example, what kind of processes are we supposed to support? What kind of policy is there that we need to support with our Inspire extension? And yeah, one thing that we actually do is, I'll come back to that later, is this analysis here, to always think of whom are we doing something for. So when we model data, we always think about the person who is at the end going to use our data for a given purpose. But first of all, let's have a look at the scope analysis. In the scope analysis, usually the idea is, like I said, to really find out very clearly what's inside the project and what's outside. And usually there are some reference documents that we can have a look at to find that out, or some other input. There are some situations where it's also far less clear-cut, where there's more like an idea, let's do X, and then we'll interview a couple of experts, and at the end we know what we should be doing. But in many situations we found that there's, for example, a legal text that describes quite exactly what needs to be done in terms of environmental reporting, for example, just to pick up Kati's presentation again. And so that already defines the scope in some sense. And that's also the typical approach, is really to find all these documents, all this information that tells us, okay, what's part of that particular process and what isn't. And then take that as a baseline. So for example here, I have this short text here. This is about, basically land rights management. So we have, for example, registering applications like building rights and so on. And here we can, in the statement text, we have words like ownership, mortgages, burdens, and easements, and so on. Those are already keywords that define what we actually need to model later on. So a typical first step is really that everybody gathers all documentation that's relevant to the project and just starts finding these nouns. So that's usually a good approach. It's really going through the text and identifying with what kind of things are we actually working. So in this case, it's land rights, it's ownership, mortgages, burdens, easements, and other things. And we just collect that as a log, typically. And when we've done that, so we might have something like this. So we collect, for example, there's an ownership registration. And we are already, from that text gathering, it should have a date of submission, submitting legal entity, owner legal entity. There's also a mortgage, and so on. We typically make a very simple list in the beginning. So we don't try to create any kinds of models in UML or other more formal languages from the first moment, but really just trying to make a list of potential things that might be a part of the scope. And when everybody has done that, you typically might have quite a long list. So there's going to be lots of things in there that might have been a bit too detailed. And that's at the point where you as a group then decide, okay, what's in and what's not in. Again, so for example, you might say, we're going to look at ownership registrations and mortgage, but for now we're not going to look at easements, for example. And yeah, after you've done that, you've really done your very first scoping. You didn't really model yet, but you've collected requirements in a rough form. And typically, the next step is then to think, okay, what are different people actually going to do with these kind of objects? So for example, with an ownership registration, who's involved? Who are the actual stakeholders that are going to do something with it? There's going to be the submitter, but there's also going to be somebody who processes it. So we have at least two stakeholders involved in that. And that brings me back to this diagram that we had here, up here. And typically, if I identify different people in different roles, I will create a persona for each one of them. A persona is like an abstract person, so I'm not going to say, for example, I'm not going to use a real person's name, but actually it's like a character in a movie, you could say. I'm going to give him a name and describe how old he is and some of his skills and so on. And I'm going to use that person, for example, let's say it's a, 36-year-old woman who wants to buy some property. And she has these and these skills. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the person who's working in the land registry, for example. So he might be a 42-year-old man and he has these and these skills. I'm going to drive with this the later activities. So now that I know who's involved, I still need to find out what are they actually doing. And that's something we're typically covering in user stories. Who of you has ever worked with user stories? 1, 2, 3? Okay, in that case, I might want to explain briefly. All right, so a user story is that's also part in here. Go down here. Yeah, so user story, there's also a fuller definition here, but what's important to remember is a user story is written from the perspective of one user and describes in one sentence what that person is trying to do with the system and why. So here we have, for example, this is from a concrete project. As a data manager, I must be able to upload a GML file to create a predefined dataset download service. So it takes reference to one persona or one user type we've defined before. That's the first thing. It also indicates how important the requirement is, how important this user story is, or must is the strongest way of saying that. It describes what that person wants to do and why. And so that's a very, very brief form of describing that. And that's typically the next step that we do is really, before we actually get into the modeling, we really want to know who and why and what. So we create these user stories for the data model. Here's one that's more concrete in terms of the data model. So as a data manager, I must be able to combine multiple land parcels into one land parcel without losing records of the individual parcels. And typically what we get then is that for each of these things, of these objects that we've identified previously and that are in scope, we identify the actors and the user stories. Ideally, I also recommend doing one more thing, which is writing a scenario. And a scenario is, while the user story is pretty atomic, so a user story describes one thing, literally like I'm X and I need to do Y. But the scenario is like a whole narrative, so it describes the whole flow through the system from the perspective of one person. So it's not just an isolated function, but it's rather typically something that involves many functions. Here in this case, for example, we created one that describes how even two people are collaborating on a certain event. The scenarios are also something that really helps in understanding what the actual needs are and how the things are going to play together. So from my experience, writing down a scenario gives a great opportunity in a team and also with external stakeholders to ensure that everybody is actually on the same page. So because you're not just having you're not just looking at the atoms, more or less, but you're really trying to look at the whole thing, what happens from start to end. It gives you a great opportunity to really make sure that everybody understands what you're trying to achieve in the same way. So typically, I really recommend to do these things all in parallel. It might sound like a lot of upfront work, but actually it's going to save you a lot of headaches later on, especially if it's not that clear-cut what you need to do. We've really often found when we worked with clients who needed to do data modeling projects that if that wasn't done in the beginning, there would be massive discussions much later on. Yeah, so at the end, ideally, at the end of this phase, you have the scope and you have described the involved personas. You've created user stories for each of the individual data elements and how they are being manipulated by whom. And you've created the scenario that describes basically the whole flow of activity through that system that the data model is going to be a part of. So yeah, that's the other thing. So we're not just building data models for fun, but we're building them to really be used. Ideally, they are fun to use after all, but that's not always the case. Okay, good. So yeah, that's actually the largest part of the analysis. So when we've done that, typically one more thing is that we also describe, we add additional information. So we've now provided like an overview of the functionality that we need, and then it's about digging down, right? So for example, the user stories, it often makes sense to qualify them a bit. So going from the one-sentence description and then adding a couple of things. And the most important of these things is typically the definition of done. So that means often we have somewhat loose user stories. I mean, it's a one-sentence description. You can't be super precise. But the definition of done, for example, could say that it has to work exactly with these and these data sets and these encodings and these versions and so on. So you typically provide a list of things that need to be fulfilled before you would actually consider that particular user story to be really completed. Yeah. In some cases, you might also at the level of the user story already include a design. So for example, because the actual one of the documents already mandated it. So the example that we're using throughout the study later is the CDDA reporting. And there's a description of how that's done with MS Access databases. So if there's an Inspire extension, it actually should pick up that description and see if there are any structures or design parts that we need to directly use. Yeah, another thing that's often included is preconditions and postconditions. So that's, for example, about statements about what needs to happen before and after this particular user story is done. The classical example is for a precondition you need to be logged in, or more in the sense of a data model, field X already needs to be filled before this can happen. So in the precondition you could say, I need to have 2 parcels that are complete with this and this information, and these are records before this can actually happen. Yeah. So when you've done that, you've actually created a good overview of the what you need to do and why you need to do it. But you haven't yet decided how you're going to do it. So that's the next step. First of all, you need to find out how much exactly you are going to do. So we are talking about extending Inspire data specifications, and for that it's pretty important that we actually have a look at what is already in the specifications. And a long time back, we only had these long PDF documents. So, and I have to admit that for many people, they are not very accessible. It's not easy to find out with the original data specifications for somebody who wasn't involved from early on in finding out what's relevant for them. But now we actually have things like the interactive data specifications. So that makes that already a bit easier, because here I can find out with this Find Your Scope tool. I'm just going to do the direct search for this time via different workflows, what might be relevant to you. So for example, we're looking at cadastral things. Okay, so there's cadastral parcel available here. And that's much faster than trying to browse through a couple hundred pages of PDF, obviously. So I think it's really important that for each of the terms that we actually collected in the beginning of the spatial object types, that we use these tools and we really find out, okay, what's out there already? So what can we connect to? What can we reuse there? Yeah, and when you've done that, you basically get a good understanding of what of your requirements might already be partially covered or even entirely covered. So one thing is, for example, we've seen in the extensions that are in the catalog here is that many of them are relatively small. So they add 1 or 2 types, and each one has maybe 5 to 10 properties. So there's actually quite a lot covered already in many situations. In some cases it's different. There are dozens of classes being added with hundreds of properties, but for many not so complicated use cases, you actually don't need to add that much. So yeah, when you've identified the relevant spatial object types, like for example in this case, let's say we want to look at cadastral parcel, it typically makes sense to compare them to the requirements that we've already figured out before. And here I would really recommend to basically just do a validation of the requirements coverage. So you really take each of your requirements that you found, user stories for example, and compare them how well they would work against this model that's already there. So we typically do it like this. We make a simple table. We have our list of user stories, and we describe then exactly what the existing model already covers. So we really look at this, okay, if I want to do X, what would I do with the model? I have this data structure, but I need that field. So basically, I sit down and really think this through and keep notes of what's covered already and what's not covered. And that gives me a good impression of what I need to extend already and provides great input for the further process. So here, for example, we can say, for this, there's a user story that I read before that requires me to join 2 parcels together. And here we see already, okay, there's a local class parcel that we can match with the Inspire class cadastral parcel. And there were several properties that were mentioned in the user story, like begin lifespan and end lifespan, and I put a couple of others that we can directly use. Yeah, but we also notice, okay, there's no cadastral parcel, there's no reference in cadastral parcel to other parcels that indicates how it was aggregated. Yeah. When we've done that, we should still consider that to be tentative. So for example, we've used tentative class names and object names, but we still might have to change them later on. But what this gives us really is a detailed understanding of how we actually, of what we really will need to model afterwards. Yeah. Okay. And now that we know what we actually need to do, the next part would be the modeling part. So that was planned for after the break. So I'd like to ask whether you have any feedback, any questions regarding the analysis methodology that I've just described. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I can do it under hydrographic if it's important for my river on the screen, or I can do it under buildings. It depends on the properties I want to model. Something like that.
Yeah, so generally we've seen a lot of extensions that pick elements from more than one theme. I think the record was like 10 or so. And the question is more or less then from my perspective on if you create an individual object and you want to say that object is both a dam and it's a structure in a hydrographic network, how would you do that? And that's exactly what the designing part is about. So there are actually 3 solutions that come to my mind immediately. And those are exactly the patterns that we can have a look at later on. And yeah, like I said, so basically reusing things from different Inspire themes at once is not a problem at all. And then these statements like, okay, what is this now? This thing, should it be more inherited from a building, for example, or is it a dam? I'm not sure what's the appropriate structure. I forgot, sorry. I don't know all the Inspire models by heart yet. Yeah, and yeah, that would really be a thing of the patterns then.
I totally agree with you that it's important for e-reporting under different environmental directives to extend the models. But one experience from what the framework directive was
That's true. Yeah, there's also some structures that are typically giving specific problems, like, for example, what we've seen quite often is there's a nesting depth of up to 10, in particular when using things like CI citation and the like. Yeah, and I think that's actually also one of the trade-offs that you will have to make in the actual design afterwards. You know already what kind of platforms you're going to implement this on, and in my view, it should be taken into account. So just don't design the hell out of your model and then later on realize that you have, for example, 100 tables or more that you need to fill, if that's going to be an issue. I've actually seen a model with 5,000 tables. I thought that was a bit over the top, but well. Yeah, Dominique?
Maybe it's related to the next thing, but what is really the scope? Is it just about pure extension of Inspire, being Inspire conformant, or is it more flexible about making models that are Inspire profile, not always conformant?
No, well, actually, yeah, you could easily use that whole process to create models that are Inspire compliant as well, in the sense of that they follow the same rules regarding, for example, how to derive the schema, how to create compliant schemas in the sense of that they use the same structures and geometries and so on, basically the same encoding. That would be possible. But like I said, in my view, usually there is some overlap anyway, so the things that you could reuse, but you wouldn't have to. I would just be surprised that if you made this comparison and the result would be there is no overlap, for example. You can still later choose extension patterns that decouple the two parts. So you can say, even though I have a lot of overlap between the two, I still want to couple them only very loosely. So what Kati presented before was a way of close coupling the two, but there are also patterns that just use references of some kind, of different types, to make it clear that there is some connection to the Inspire data types, for example.
I think you need to come back to your question. You can use certain techniques also for profiling. So you use constraining to further profile the Inspire data specification, and then it's just a matter of the constraint if you are still complying or if you actually introduce constraints which are in conflict with the data specifications. I think that, as I understood, the original purpose of the study was actually to develop ways how it can be extended in this scope.
Yeah. Okay, no problem.
From your experience, I would like to ask you if it would be a good idea to put the code lists for the e-reporting, because they are fixed, we use them already, the interactive data specifications, so that we maybe have a chance to connect both communities, Inspire community and the bottom community, to have a kind of crowdsourcing for good ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the end that's something we have to provide. So we have a core which is more or less relatively formally controlled in Inspire, but surrounding that we have many opportunities to do things together as a community. And for me, this website is also one such thing, where people can just, like I explained in the beginning, they are able to go there and register in another extension. And I think there will also be places for doing that for code lists and so on, for example. That's something I think there's work going on in that area. Yeah. So, who wants to go for a cup of coffee? Great. Okay, so thank you all for attending this first block. So the second block is going to be about the actual design and the patterns and about what we're going to do in the future. So please come back. It's still going to be interesting. And see you in 35 minutes.